Hi there. My name is Regina Sexton, and I'm a food and culinary historian at University College Cork. And I'm very happy to join you for Heritage Week 2020. And as my research area is food and culinary history, today I want to talk to you about food, but food associated with a particular group at a particular point in time. So my talk today is going to look at food and culinary cultures in the Irish country house at a specific period. And the focus that I want to take today is on the 18th century and the early 19th century. And the reason I've chosen to look at this period in particular is for a number of reasons. The first is that a number of years back, I did quite a lot of research work on the handwritten manuscript books associated with women and associated with the country houses in Ireland. And many of those would have been dealing with the 18th century and the early 19th century. But aside from the handwritten manuscript receipt books, the 18th century is a very interesting time for food in Ireland, in Britain, in Europe, and in the New World, in the Americas. There are lots of different things happening. So there is overall, I suppose, great culinary activity. How we think about food today, particularly how we perceive taste associated with dishes, be they sweet or savoury. This kind of separation into two categories of something savoury, something sweet. A lot of this kind of separation and disentanglement from connections with the past is happening throughout the 18th century, very often linked to, promoted by, and on the back of the importation of sugar into Europe, into Britain, into Ireland from the American sugar plantations at this point in time. So there's great activity going on in that respect, and this has incredible impacts and significance for how food, dishes, cooking, preservation, all aspects of food, in fact, how these change and develop throughout the long 18th century. The other thing that's happening is that it's a great time for specialist food suppliers, grocers, and so on. So you see all their activity as well and how they impact on a changing food scene. And the other point that is worth noting is that in the 18th century, we see the upsurge in the printing, the availability and the distribution of printed cookery books, specifically coming out of Britain. And this frenzy of activity in terms of cookbook production also impacts on food developments at this particular time. So that's what I want to do with you today. Well, what I want to do essentially is that I want to look at the recipe books, because the handwritten recipe books called manuscript receipt books or manuscript recipe books associated with the country houses in Ireland. I want to look at those because they're actually a very interesting prism in which to view all of these wider socioeconomic and sociocultural changes that are happening both in Ireland and further afield, and globally if you want to take in the new transatlantic markets. So they're a very interesting way of viewing all of these developments. So in fact, they're very rich sources of information for us. So that's what I want to do for today. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start showing you some of my slides. So I'm just going to have to share my screen here. So do please bear with me. And we hope that we can share this without any problem. So, as I said, the title of the talk from me today is The Food and Culinary Cultures of the Irish Country Houses. And as I said to you at the top, I work in University College Cork. Here you can see our main campus. And there I do a number of things, but what I love to do, in fact, is that I'm the postgraduate, I'm the program manager for our new postgraduate diploma in Irish food culture. And this is a really new course. It only started in September 2019. And in fact, it's the only course in Ireland that takes a dedicated concentrated, dedicated focus on Irish food, both in the past and in contemporary context. And should you like to learn more, the link for that course is below. You can see it on the screen now. But just aside from that work, what I do want to talk to you about, as I said, are the manuscript receipt books, how these relate to a particular group in Ireland in the 18th century, this wealthy landed gentry group, both minor and major gentry. And before we just get into looking at the collections themselves, I just want to kind of scene set things for you. So I've just shown you a number of these kind of notable houses where you would expect to find these manuscript receipt books. And the first one on screen here is Townley Hall near Drogheda in County Louth, the estate house of the Townley Balfour family. Now I will come back to this later on in the talk as well. And just moving along, just to show you another one. This you might recognise is Feett House, east of Cork City, not far from the town of Cove. Now this aerial view is quite interesting because it shows you how the landscape is managed for various different activities. And a lot of that landscape is actually managed for food production. This is the house itself. Behind here are the working areas. And we will come back to this at the end, so I'm going to flip back to this at the very end of this talk. So just bear this image in mind and we will come back to it. Now these two gardens here that you see, these very ornate structured gardens, are now pleasure gardens, ornamental gardens, but earlier on in the house's history, and the house was belonging to the Smith Barrys, originally started off as a hunting lodge, but it was extended considerably in the early 19th century. Again, this is of relevance towards the end of the talk. But these ornamental gardens would, at one point, one of them at least, would have been the house's kitchen garden for growing supplies of fruits and vegetables in particular to bring to the house. Over here, this collection of trees that you see is in fact the old orchard. And up here in the corner, if my cursor will work, is the head gardener's house. Head gardener, supremely important as a member of staff, as is the butler, the housekeeper, and the cook. These are kind of the upper layer of staff, because their duties are so consequential to the reputation and the status of the house. So this is the head gardener's house, which actually has a banana tree, and over here is the frame yard. Now actually, the orchards are in the process of being restored. The frame yard has been restored in recent times. And what the frame yard refers to is a walled garden that contains many different glasshouses, different sizes, different functions. And a lot of these would be dedicated to the production of tender delicacies, exotics, again, to produce food for the table. In later years, a lot of the frames in the frame yard in Feett were used for keeping, propagating and growing ornamental plants and shrubs for the estate rather than food. So I suppose this is kind of our scene setting. What we're dealing with here is a specific, I suppose, social group in Irish society. As I say, the landed gentry, who are wealthy, major and minor gentry. And the economic environment at this point in time in the 18th century in Ireland allowed the gentry essentially to embrace a more modern food culture as Ireland aligned more closely with external food developments. The effects, for example, of opening up the New World and the New World markets, and the associated rise in more complex networks of trade and food distribution, had widespread impact on the diet throughout the 19th century. This period saw considerable culinary changes and developments. And essentially what you could say is that you can kind of, this is Strokestown House, another one of the houses that we'll go back to in a minute. But what you could say essentially is that there were kind of a number of major developments. The first was that there was an older system whereby meat was a high status item. Meat in this period retained its importance as a high status item in the diet. There was an increase in the consumption of luxury and exotic commodities. We'll talk about those later on. And there was also a stronger leaning towards food produced or sourced through specialist suppliers. And that could be coming in from local markets or markets that were further afield. And we've mentioned already the transatlantic trade and how important and impactful sugar would be through those trading routes. The other thing I do is that I just don't look at the recipe books. I'm kind of curious to see if these recipes work. And for the most part, they do. And they produce dishes that are very heavy in some instances, but they're also very delicious. And the reason being is because of the, I suppose, the variety and the quality of the ingredients that mix flavor, aromatics, fat, and flavor, and so on. So the image you're seeing on screen now is some work I did a few years back for a television production called The Big House, which was filmed on location in Strokestown House. And here what you see are two girls who are in the roles of the kitchen maids, and they're preparing some food for a dinner, an 18th century dinner that was served later that evening. And just to show you some of the dishes here, it's not just all reading recipes, it's actually, there's a practical dimension to it as well. So these would be kind of typical dishes from the 18th century. And I'm going to go just clockwise here. The top one is a dish called black caps, because as you can see, the term describes very much the dish. And these are baked apples with lots of sugar and some alcohol components like wine, and an aromatic like rose water or orange water. Moving around, then you have sweetbread ragu, which are sweetbreads that have been breaded, but they're also stuffed with a very rich, what you might kind of call a kind of a sausage meat stuffing. They call it force meat. And this is based on marrow, other meat components, highly spiced herbs, egg, and salt and pepper. Here we have an egg fricassee. These are boiled eggs that are cooked a little bit further with cream, some savoury flavourings, and butter. It's very rich, as you can see. And here, quite a well-known dish called beef olives, which is kind of a prime cut of beef that has been kind of hammered flat, so that you can roll it again with a different force meat stuffing. And this dish is finished off in a very beefy, strongly flavoured brown gravy, which actually took the whole day before to make. This is very labour intensive. All of these dishes are quite labour intensive, hence the need for a number of kitchen staff. And the last dish up here is a dish called potato pudding, which is quite popular. You find recipes for nearly all the collections. And again, this is a dish that is based on mashed potatoes, mealy potatoes mixed up with butter, eggs, cream, sugar, spice, an alcohol component sometimes, and a lot of sugar, as I said, a lot of butter. And this is all mixed up almost to a batter consistency. It's poured into this baking dish. There is pastry surrounding it. And I suppose the best way to describe this to you is that it reminds me to some extent of kind of like the texture of a baked cheesecake. And in fact, if you didn't know that the base ingredient here was potatoes, you'd never guess. So transformed and disguised are the potatoes in this particular dish. Just keep this in mind as well, this image, because we will be coming back to table settings later on in the presentation, but might be good just to keep that in your mind. This obviously has been, people have been taking food from it and so on, so it's not as symmetrical or as neat as the ambition for the table planning might be at the start of the meal. The other thing that's happening as kind of a big backdrop concern in this period is that there is a noteworthy increase in the outputs and production of printed cookbooks, particularly in Britain in the 18th century. This graph here is taken from the book across. You can see the details on the slide. And what the authors have done here is that they have there's a broken line and an unbroken line. The broken line represents French outputs of cookery books. The unbroken line is Britain. And they start in the late 15th century, going up to the late 18th century. But have a look there, you'll see in the middle of the 17th century, there is a spike in both places. The spike in England could refer to the Restoration period, when again you have activity in print book production. The classic that's coming out of England at the time is a collection of recipes by a very influential court-associated chef cook called Robert May. But then another thing is happening in France, and this is on the back of the work of La Varenne, and he publishes a cookery book in 1651, and he is advocating for a simpler approach to cooking, pared down approach, and one that recognises the intrinsic integrity, the intrinsic flavour, the intrinsic quality of the ingredient. And this movement is a break from, I suppose, what he was coming from. And this was this kind of, I suppose, a legacy from the medieval period of having lots of different flavourings, textures, all together in the one dish. And this sort of very confusing, highly impactful kind of sensory experience with food. And he was advocating this simpler approach, which was the first, I suppose, new way of looking at food, a nouvelle cuisine movement. Now, as I say, a lot of these developments we can see by reading through the recipe books and the handwritten recipe books and the printed recipe books as well. But I suppose one of the big topics that will flow through the 18th century is the increased importation and the increased demand and the increased consumption of sugar, not just in Ireland, but in Britain and in Europe. And this is sugar that is being produced in the slave plantations, the sugar plantations in the Americas. And while we might have a very interesting story about food developments in the 18th century in Ireland and Britain and in Europe, there is a very dark side to that story as well, which I think we're only coming around to thinking about now. And a lot of that work and that way of thinking has already been set by the anthropologist Sidney Mince in his seminal work, Sweetness and Power, which was published in 1985. And he took one ingredient as a way of looking at power, of privilege, exploitation, and so on. Again, by looking just at one ingredient, and sugar in this case. And sugar is this ingredient that is going to cause all sorts of culinary developments, new approaches, new ways of dealing with things, new service to the table, new courses. It's going to have considerable impacts on food developments throughout the 18th century. The other, I suppose, reason why sugar was important was that it kind of went hand in hand with the relatively newly introduced hot beverages, tea, coffee to some extent, and drinking chocolate. So tea was made more palatable with sugar. Chocolate became this beautiful commodity by the addition of sugar, because it's very bitter if it doesn't have sugar and so on. So sugar went hand in hand with these new beverages and the rituals around these consumption of these beverages. And while the trade in sugar would never compare to that you see in Britain, the demand did expand and grow after 1740. By the late 18th century, imports into Ireland were 5 times what they had been in the 1730s. The increased availability of sugar throughout the 18th century brought revolutionary culinary changes. It also made possible an upsurge in the preservation of garden fruits and the production of an extensive range of wet and dry sweetmeats like jams, jellies, marmalades, confits, conserves, cordials, syrups, sugar pastes, and sugar ornaments. It enabled enriched breads to branch off into a larger family of baked goods that included cakes like plum cake or fruit cake, which is a classic serving with afternoon tea in this period, seed cakes, saffron cakes, ginger cakes, buns, biscuits, tarts, pies. And then when sugar was combined with cream and eggs and flavourings, it gave rise to a substantial increase in the range of cream dishes, syllabubs, cheesecakes, whips, puddings, as well as curd and soft cheese dishes. Printed cookery books supported these developments by supplying chapters dedicated to the preserving, baking, to making creams and all those creamy things, and puddings. And of course, the important ingredient in all of these was puddings. And so too, this sort of specialization and diversification in cooking is also witnessed in the collections of Irish manuscript receipt books. So while sugar is the active agent in dividing dishes between a sweet and a savoury classification, you will see the odd remnant of an older order, an older practice. And this is kind of remembered, I suppose, for us in the continued popularity of the minced pie into contemporary times. This recipe here is an 18th century one taken from the Townley Hall papers, and we'll go back and have a look at that later on. But what I wanted to show you was that this recipe here remembers an older style of cooking, I suppose, that is more rooted in the pre-18th century period, a strong stamp of medieval practice about it. So it's got meat, fat, sugar, spice, and dried fruits, and the aromatic rose water, all combined in this one dish. So that's all mixed together, and then it's placed in a term that again is a legacy from the past, a coffin, which is simply a pastry case or a pastry shell, and this is the minced pie. Now, this practice actually of using meat in the minced meat, very often based on minced tongue, continues well into the 19th century. Today we make mince pie still. The meat element is gone unless you're using suet as your fat type in the array of ingredients for making mince pies. The other thing that's happening at this point in time as well, to go with all of the other changes that we've just described, is that there is increased output as well in material artifacts, I suppose, of goods, things, objects, stuff that's associated with kitchen work, like kitchen utensils and so on, but also the items that are needed for service to the table. You can see all the silver here. This is a shot taken from Strokestown House for the filming that we were involved with, and you get sort of specializations as well in all of these goods, like sugar tongs, because they will feed into this ritual of using sugar more, sugar with tea and chocolate and so on. You get asparagus tongs, but also syllabub glasses, cake hoops, chocolate pots, fruit and sweet meat, aprons, which I'll show you in a second, cake plates, cream and jelly molds. And all of these activities brought kind of a decided elaboration to the rituals of dining and food preparation. And the upsurge in energy and activities around the commercial and material culture of food characterized the second half of the 18th century. And in Ireland, I suppose, it was one expression of an Irish participation in this feverish consumerism that was gripping Western Europe. And I just put this slide in because this is an apron that is held in the collections owned by University College Cork. Actually, this is on display in campus. And this is a sterling silver apron. It's a table centerpiece. As you can see, it's staggeringly flamboyant. But even though we have it in UCC, it's actually made in Dublin in 1789. And what this is a flamboyant centerpiece. It's a series of baskets that would hold different things like nuts, fruits, maybe candied fruits, sweetmeats, and so on. And it was there to offer profusion and diversity to the table, but it was also there to make a huge statement. And a lot of the foods here as well would be ones based on sugar, sugar work, confectionery, and the like. So this is my collection of Irish manuscript receipt books, and I should say that the books that I would have researched and studied are the ones that are held. It's probably the largest collection of manuscript receipt books from the estates in Ireland is held by the National Library in Dublin, and actually you can request to go and see any collection, and you can spend some time with it. You can go through the recipes and read the book and so on request. So this is kind of just like a collage of what you'll find. There's great variety in the physicality of the books themselves. This very flamboyant one here from Mary Ponsonby dates to the middle of the 19th century. It's an 18th century collection here with a recipe for chocolate cream, this new ingredient that's coming in again from the Americas. Here is just an example of a contents page from one collection. Over here is a book we'll go back to later on. It's Mrs. Baker's recipe book from the early 19th century from Kilkenny, and there's her recipe here for gooseberry jelly. And up here there is a jelly for the weakness, okay, because this idea of food and medicine is intertwined and always has been for a long time. So when you look at the corpus, the collection, the body of Irish manuscript receipt books, a lot of them as well, of course, are still held in private ownership. But the ones I'm looking at specifically are associated with the National Library. But if you look at the corpus of Irish manuscript receipt books, even though there's great diversity in the physicality of them, what you do see, however, is that they share common characteristics in their content and cookery styles that point to the existence of a distinctive culinary culture amongst the gentry in pre-famine Ireland, a culture that was heavily influenced by, if not indistinguishable from, English practice. So when you look at these books, as I say, you'll find great parallels with manuscript receipt books from English houses. You'll find great overlap between the recipes that are being printed in the English books that are coming into Ireland at this period. Some of those English books are actually printed in the Irish, and a lot of the Irish cities like Dublin and Cork and so on. So what these are really, these are feeding into the food practices, the food fashions and the food trends that are associated with Britain. And the aspiration is to align with that culture. You'll rarely find, I suppose, recipes that you could maybe pin back to a more Irish way with food. Occasionally you'll come across recipes for things like, the Sligo way to pickle salmon, or Irish stew, or Irish mutton stew, the occasional recipe for soda bread. But these, for the most part, are the exception rather than the norm in these collections. So let's have a look inside one of them, and I'm going to move on to Mrs. Baker's book there. So you can see this is her inscription book, Mrs. A.W. Baker. Her book, volume 1, it's believed there was a volume 2, which is now lost, and she began this collection of recipes in 1810. So, as I've said already, the contents and the style of dishes, the style of cookery and so on is shared across this social group with their inclusion of recipes in their books. Parallels, connections with Britain are very strong, but there's other sort of features about the book as well, which unify them as a collection, as a corpus. So if you look at here, this is one of the contents pages, one of many in Mrs. Baker's book. And if you look at the recipes there from the top of the page for lemon pudding until the bottom of the page for pepper vinegar, you'll see that the majority of these recipes are from a Lady Anne Fitzgerald. And this is a feature of the collections as well, where you'll see that recipes are included in collections that come from friends, come from family. And in this instance, you can assume that these recipes are sourced from an influential woman of high standing in this particular social group, this social circle. So having Lady Anne's recipe in your book says so much, because you're aligning with influence, with notables. So it's got to do with status and creating the right impression. So if the recipe could have been passed on directly from Lady Anne Fitzgerald, which again says so much, could have been given to Mrs. Baker by Lady Anne Fitzgerald. So here you're talking about groupings and networks and the building of relationships through the vehicle of the recipe. And other ones here, you just get the idea of family inheritance, where there is to fry oysters from my grandmother. And then below it is a sauce for green ducks. The other thing I suppose I just want to say is that even though there's commonality in terms of the content, the physicality of them different, but these are the features that they hold in common. So the recipes are typical of a British repertoire, as we said. The recipes can be inherited or received from somebody. Sometimes the recipes will have little notes and marginalia and things like that, which tells us that even though some of the recipe books can be accused of being aspirational in what they would like to create and offer at table, you'll see that a lot of this kind of marginalia and the addition of notes that's going on does speak to us, and it does say that these were alive, you know, they were active, and there's this kind of input of the cook or the person who's tasted the dish placed in addition to the text of the recipe itself. So you'll get comments like, this is a very good recipe, try it. This is a really atrocious recipe, don't try it. Or sometimes they add improving notes in kind of tip form. As I said, a lot of the recipes are exchanged between family and friends. And a lot of the recipes are taken directly from the printed books. They're lifted verbatim from the printed book. So there's this strange relationship going on between manuscript and print and manuscript, influences, hybridizations, fusions, and so on. It's quite interesting to read and to explore in these collections. You saw some of the other bound volumes, which looked very, very well in earlier science. But this, I just put this slide in. It's interesting because you never know what to expect when you order a manuscript to read in the National Library. So this one came out just as a folder with loose-leafed recipes. Some of them are photocopied, actually. So how they have been preserved and their extant existence and how they come down to us is really various. And so on. The other thing I suppose about these collections, which is quite interesting, is that until kind of recently, they weren't looked upon as being kind of worthy of academic research or attention. Which is quite unfortunate, really, because these are a wonderful historical source, and I see these collections as windows into social, economic, and cultural developments and changes and realities. So they are, in fact, very powerful, meaning-rich cultural artifacts. And what they do essentially is convey the determination of wealthy women to control and direct domestic food culture. So instead of dismissing the collections as inconsequential, random kind of playthings of women, it is more worthwhile to view the acquisition of recipes, their selection, what these women chose to include in their collections, how the recipes circulated within the group, how they were enacted, you know, the kind of the physicality of making up these dishes and what that demanded, which doesn't come through in a lot of the recipes. And then obviously the final act, the consumption of the dish. I would view these as symbolic acts that kind of build a sense of culinary capital within a group. The recipe itself strengthened networks of influence and engaged the group in reciprocal relationships of borrowing, sharing, and consumption. They mixed family inheritance with ideas of fashion brought with change. And ultimately what they did was they framed a particular and shared identity for those who built, engaged with, and guarded the collections, because not everything was allowed in terms of recipe, and not everybody has access to these collections. There is a community around these collections of women who exchange the recipes, share them, borrow them, and so on. And then there is the community of the people working on the recipes, like the kitchen staff, particularly the cook, who is quite influential in terms of the hierarchy of staff, and the kitchen maids, and so on. So they were guarded, and what went into the collections was notable, and we'll come back to that again. But what I do want to do now is move on and look at a particular collection of recipes. And these are the recipe books associated with, as we've seen already, Townley Hall in County Louth, not too far from Drogheda. And as I said, this is the estate house of the Townley Balfours. These were a family from the gentry who were associated with counties Louth and Fermanagh since the Cromwellian periods, but they also had land holdings that extended into Meath and Westmeath. Their country estate was at Townley Hall here that you're looking at on screen. This is a Francis Johnson designed house that was built in the late 1790s by Blamey Townley Balfour, one of the family, not long after he came back from his grand tour in Europe. Architecturally, the house style and aesthetic can be described as restrained, refined, and full of hidden but well-considered details. And these characteristics, I think, can also be applied to describe the food and culinary cultures of the Townley Balfours, which were, not surprisingly, closely aligned in style and dining rituals to the patterns of elite consumption common to high-standing gentry and aristocratic groups in both Ireland and Britain. Therefore, it can be argued that for the Townley Balfours, food, meals, and dining were just as important an expression of what the historian Toby Barnard describes as the preoccupation with making the right impression. And while the house and the furniture and the entertainments and the local offices all contributed to this making of the grand figure, so too did their choice of meals and dining rituals. Much was invested in the recipe to communicate good character and aesthetic refinement, while in extending hospitality to dinner guests, house guests. The choice of dishes made to carefully selected recipes was a stylish, though indirect, statement of the family's ambitions of status, good standing, and good taste. The reason why the Townley Hall papers is interesting is not only do they have a collection of recipe books that span the 18th century into the early 19th century, but also the estate papers are rich in documentation, other types of documentation that refer to the food culture here. So you get things like account books, and account books are really interesting because what they are lists of things that are bought, expenditure. A lot of that is concerned with food procurement. So you see what's been brought into the house and the cost and so on. There's also some inventories associated with Townley House that would list items in the house, not just, the dining room, contents of dining rooms, bedrooms, and all that sort of stuff. But the dining room contents and the kitchen contents are interesting in this context, in telling us the material culture of food in this instance. And also for Townley, what there is a little small notebook of menus and table settings, which I'll go back to later on. So the account books are really interesting, for example, because they tell us what they're buying. So they're buying kind of staples like milk, butter, meat, and offal. Now, the estate could probably produce these, but when kind of the demand for these exceeded home supply, they went to the market. There's also luxury goods. And there's the lists of corresponding suppliers to the house, like the grocers, the bakers, the confectioners, the butchers, the milk sellers. They're buying in at some points in the year, sometimes beef offal, like sweetbreads and tongues that we've met already, veal offcuts like calves' heads and calves' feet. And also then, of course, you get the occasional fish, salmon and trout in this instance are mentioned, shellfish like oysters, lobsters and crayfish. There's sporadic purchases of fruit, non-specified vegetables like asparagus, scallions and potatoes, even though a lot of that would have been grown in the gardens. We know that from the seedmen that were supplying the house and their records. But the grocery items are both numerous and various. So you get references to things like mustard, raisins, spice, sugar, highly fashionable French sweetmeats, cheese, almonds, anchovies. Isinglass, which is a material for setting and moulding foods, oranges, lemons, chocolate, tea, coffee, salt, saltpeter, vinegar, and miscellaneous purchases of rennet, which suggests on-site production of cheese, and in fact the frequent purchases of dairy equipment like wooden bowls and skimming dishes does point to the domestic activities around the preparation of butter and cheese. A lot of the exotics that are coming into the house that we can see from the grocers and specialist suppliers through the account books, these are goods that are expensive. They're coming in from markets that are local, but they're also further afield into Europe. Like they're getting in Parmesan cheese, for example, but also a lot of these goods are coming in via the transatlantic trade routes. And here again, I go back to this predominance and the power and the importance of sugar at this point in time. So these goods that are bought in, I suppose, were not only emblematic of wealth. Access to grocery items in particular brought consumers into active contact with more progressive and modern food systems. High and frequent consumption of groceries above all else characterized the diet of the elite because of the ability of these goods like sugar, spice, anchovies and isinglass to transform staple and mainstream ingredients into dishes appropriate for refined dining. So the Townley Hall recipe collections are replete with pertinent examples in this respect. Commonplace ingredients like oatmeal and coarse brown bread are transformed into very elaborate, refined and highly flavoured dishes when they come and develop a relationship with these more exotic dishes, ingredients. The ingredients in the cookery methods and the classification of dishes in the Townley Hall collections, as we said, conforms to a distinctive cookery style that was common across the Irish corpus, the Irish corpus receipt books. This style is echoed in the principles of profusion, diversity, and variety. Diversity and variety is well illustrated in the cases of fruit and baked goods. The range of fruits featured in the collections, whether these are brought in or homegrown, include exotics, obviously brought in, like oranges and melons, but also hot-bred fruits could grow themselves, like melons. Tree fruit like cherries, apricots, apples, plums, pears, damsons, and quinces. Berries like gooseberries, strawberries, raspberries, barberries, used for garnishing a lot. Elderberries and blackberries, currants red and white, which were variously made into preserves, marmalades, compotes, vinegars, wines, cordials. Some fruits being candied, dried, or preserved whole. There's also a lot of recipes for baked goods, a lot of cakes, because this is the era of the cake: plum, seed, saffron, almond, Shrewsbury, breads and enriched breads like comfortable bread, gingerbread, saffron bread, soda bread recipe here in this instance, a lot of biscuits and pastry. Profusion is best seen in the classification of dishes by category. So you get categories for pastry, sweet and savoury puddings, sweet and savoury pies, preserves, pickles, fricassees, soups, sauce, jellies, tarts, cakes, creams, custards, candies, sweetmeats, and dried fruits. Luxury imports played a central role in all these categories. They also imparted distinctive flavours. For instance, the heavy flavouring of anchovies on a made savoury dish, or the perfume of rosewater. While mainstream ingredients, items like butter, cream, and eggs, were commonly used in large quantities in any one dish, making dishes in this convention heavy and rich in fat and flavour. Cooking techniques can be broadly divided between plain cookery, roasting, boiling, broiling, and baking, even though I'll come back to that point in a minute, and then a more modulated approach in the creation of made dishes, which I'll also come back to in a second. This just to give you an idea of the kind of the environment of the Townley Hall papers. This is the quite spectacular cantilevered staircase, which is leading upstairs, obviously, but it's also carrying the eye to this really impressive glass dome. And this instance here, you can see the blue sky with the little scattering of clouds peeping through. So this is one of the earlier recipe books in Townley Hall from Mrs. Jane Bury, from her collection, which started in 1700. And here we have one of her recipes, which is the ink is faded, but you can still read it. And this is a recipe for, we've mentioned it already, a fricassee, based on either veal, lamb, or chicken. And you can see this is no simple meat dish. It's got the herbs, spices, it's got anchovies, all sorts of flamboyance going on, and then to finish it all off, it's garnished with lemons and force balls. And these force balls would be more like, we mentioned them with the sweetbreads at the top of the presentation. These are most like sausage meat and so on, but very heavily flavoured, and some of them with a base of bone marrow as the fat flavouring ingredients or addition in that instance. And this, I suppose, goes back to my point that in this context, what we might view as being fairly lowly or little appreciated ingredients like calves' feet, which were an offcut, in this context, when they form relationships with a lot of these ingredients that are coming in through the external markets, when they set up a relationship with these exotics, they're transformed into something that is worthy of refined dining, so to speak, in the context of the Irish gentry, specifically here in the context of Townley Hall. Now, the recipe itself is verbatim taken from the manuscript. The spellings and the mistakes are faithfully recorded. But what the recipe doesn't do is take account of the time that's needed to actually make this dish, in that there's a lot of prep time that has to go into treating the feet, in cleaning them down and so on, before they get boiled, so that you can render material off the bone that goes into the making of the pie itself. As I said to you, a lot of the recipes in the collections are fairly selective, and they're selective in the sense that they're taking recipes that have a strong connection with sugar, like preserving, baking, and all the creamy things that we spoke about. On the savoury side, a lot of those recipes deemed worthy for inclusion would be based on this kind of categorization that's called the made dish. And I'm including, this image here is from Hannah Glass. It's a facsimile production of the first edition of her really famous cookery book, The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Simple, which comes to market in 1747. Hannah Glass becomes a bestseller at the time, and her cookery book goes into several editions. The next one you'll see here is my own late 18th century version of Hannah Glass Made Plain and Simple. Quite a special, I don't have it to hand, quite a special book because it's Hannah Glass in the late 19th century, 18th century, excuse me, but it's printed in Dublin, which again is a special feature of the book. And here what I put on screen is the contents pages from Hannah Glass's made dishes section. The made dishes here run into about 250 dishes. So these are dishes that are kind of not taking into account sort of more what we might call fundamental approaches to cooking, like boiling or baking or roasting, even though there's great skill in spit roasting. These are dishes that are kind of a bit more refined, that need recipes to support them. There's various different steps included in them to give you the finished dish. A lot of these made dishes would be hived off and brought to the table as part of the second course. So many of the manuscript receipt books, the handwritten collections, differ to the printed sources in that there is this selective inclusion of recipes, a lot associated with sugar, as I said, and a lot of these fancy made dishes. The other feature of the collection, of course, is that they're strongly associated with the activities of wealthy women within the context of the domestic setting, household economy, and so on. And in that context, a lot of the recipes speak to or suggest that women, these genteel women, have a close association with this very impactful new ingredient, sugar. So the association of women with sugar work, and also the association of women, the association of women with distillation in the still room, and also the association of women with medicinal recipes, and the production of cordials and syrups that were used for medicinal purposes. This kind of close association between these gentle women and these activities was established by the 17th century and promoted as a suitable activity for the women in these houses. And with their involvement in these refined areas of sweet cookery and medicine, the role of elite women went beyond, I suppose, economic concerns or operational concerns of household management. And I suppose what you see then is that the women, in this instance, are kind of drawn in and are set up in working situations with these new, exotic and exciting ingredients. So the collections, therefore, to varying degrees, magnify the culinary interests and activities of wealthy women and promote a gentlewoman's country house style of cooking. Indeed, with their emphasis on preserves as well as sweet dishes, baked dishes and dairy items, they also may reflect female taste preferences, or at least taste preference that were perceived to be associated with women, sweet things and so on. As I said, the collections are selective and biased towards more refined culinary operations. And very often the collections conceal the more ordered, disciplined and hierarchical world of work that scaffolded the culinary culture of the wealthy in late 18th and early 19th century Ireland. And just to go on to show you, just to move on beyond the recipe to some extent, to look at menus, and we're kind of moving towards the final act in this instance now, is the act of consumption at the table. And as I said to you, the Townley Hall papers contain this really small, very sweet notebook of menus and table plans that run from 1811 to 1815. And this is interesting because what it gives us is a visual guide to how the tables were set up after they've gone through all the recipes, they've gone through the account books and all sorts of activities associated along the line. And in this instance, what you see, it's a guide as to where the dishes should be placed on the table. How food was served on the table was quite different to how we serve it today. So today, if we have a meal that it's going to run for several courses, usually what happens is we have first course, one dish, the second course, one main dish, and so on and so on. But in the 18th century and until into the 19th century, the service ritual and conventions were different, and they conformed to this service à la française. And I suppose the best way to imagine this is like a table laden with a hot buffet of a great profusion and variety of dishes. So loads of different dishes come in, they're hot for the most part, and those dishes are arranged in a very symmetrical and ordered way on the table. So in this instance, the soup is, I'm going to get my cursor to work now, the soup is here, the green pea soup, and once that's eaten, it's replaced by roast beef. Down here, at the other side of the table, we have ducks, salmon and soles. Over here, there's other meaty dishes, like boiled lamb and bits. And over here, seems to be raised pies and fowl and veal cutlets. So this is the first course, and when the diners are sated with this, everything is taken away and it's replaced by a second course, and so on and so on. The courses can be very many depending on the type of dinner and the impression that you want to create, and of course those who are invited to the dinner in this opening up of the house in a communal way, where food and the menus and the table settings communicate so much more than just the sensory enjoyment of the dishes, because they communicate status, good taste, wealth, connections with these ingredients, and also a skilled workforce in the kitchen who's producing all those. In this instance, this is just the first course, and the other pages will reveal the different courses and so on as you go through. What I do want to do though is move away from Townley and kind of just pin back to photo for the last few slides of this presentation. And I spoke to you about the manuscript recipe books, the recipes, and their characteristics and their features. I spoke to you specifically about sort of the food culture of Townley Hall and our ability to see it more holistically there because of the various different kind of items of documentation. But the other way, I suppose, that we can get an insight into food cultures is by looking at the physicality of the house and so on, and specifically those areas within the house that are involved with specialist areas of work in the kitchen and so on, and then the dining room as well. So this is photo. And you saw the aerial view of this earlier, whereby the landscape was managed for food production. So if you think about the outside, now think about the inside of the house. And what photo has is, obviously you're looking at the kitchen here, but it's not just a kitchen area. It's what I would call a whole kitchen complex for different food activities, which obviously all come together to support the recipe and the different specialized areas and the production of food, be it home produced or coming in from local or further field markets. All of that is leading somewhere, and obviously it's leading to the final climax where the act there is of consumption. So what you see here is the kitchen in photo. It was a very special kitchen because it's probably one of the best preserved early 19th century kitchens in Ireland. And even though it might seem very kind of fundamental to you, it's actually very interesting because what this kitchen, this space contains are all the areas for different cooking activities and procedures. Like you have I suppose the thing that we look at first is the spit, an open spit, that kind of large spit, and smaller basket spits. There are one or two vertical spits for smaller pieces of meat hanging around. One of them's up there, a bottle jack. So these are the spits for truly roasting food, fish, meat, or whatever. So this is real roasting. Well, what you call roasting today is actually baking. So this is roasting, whereby it's food that's cooked in front of, not over a flame, and you can see the dripping tray here to collect all the meat juices and the fat and so on. That will be used in various different ways as well. So the food is cooked here, roasted before flame, and it's open to the air as well, so all the impurities can just fade away, producing very what you might call a kind of a clean roasted flavour, as opposed to what we do today with like our Sunday roast. We put it in the oven, and here is the oven here, the enclosed oven. And this, of course, was the area where all the breads, the enriched breads, the cakes, the biscuits, the tarts, the pies, and the cheesecakes, so the potato puddings were produced. Over here, we have hot plates used for boiling, simmering, for stocks, sauces, hot water, whatever you like. Over here is what you might call a sort of a little kind of, in a kind of contemporary way, you could say like a little barbecue area. So we just kind of, we have little tripods over charcoal for broiling, and what you can see in this shot is fairly large and impressive, fitted into the alcove here, a big boiling pot. So you're boiling, roasting, baking, broiling. It's all going on in this space. But I suppose the ingredients have to come from various different sources. Many of them, if home produced, will come in here through the scullery. So you've just walked through this little door here into the scullery, and this was the prep area. And that's interesting, before the ingredients are brought into the kitchen. And this is interesting here because this green door, if you open that door, it leads to a short walkway up to the kitchen gardens, the herb gardens, the fruit and vegetable gardens, and the orchards. So the produce is brought in, it's prepped in here to the main kind of cooking activity area. And from that, then you have sort of all these ancillary areas and spaces where other food activities are going on, making a whole kitchen complex for photo, which makes it so special. Here, right beside the kitchen, is the wet larder. This is for keeping perishables like beef, meats, not just beef, but meat, offal, fish. And what you see in this slide here is the carousel, one of the few game hanging carousels to survive in Ireland. This area is for kind of perishable foods, so it's a bit chilled, cooler, and it would also be the area, the work area, where a lot of the meats, things like cuts of offal like thong and fish, could be preserved by salting, sort of brining, and so on. And if you look at the floor plan for Fota here, you can see the extensive areas given over to all of this activity with food that will, as I say, culminate in the dining room, and I'll show you that in a second. So number one here, if this is kind of looking down on it, so we were already in the kitchen here, number 3. I showed you the scullery. This is the stores, kind of out that green door, it's kind of just behind us, but there's also the walkway up to the gardens, as we spoke about. There is the wet larder. Here is the dry larder, where you have all your dry ingredients. And here, number 7, is the housekeeper's private rooms and her private kitchen. Number 10, next door, is the butler's room. This is the passageway from these areas, you walk along here. And just over here is the staff dining hall, where they would have eaten their meals. And interestingly, number 6 here is what they still call in Fota the still room. And this term, this name, remembers this specialized area with working, in many cases, working specifically with sugar to make all those sweety things, the confections, the jams, the jellies, the marmalades, but also the still room being associated with medicinal concerns and medicinal recipes, many of those bringing in sugar because of its perceived curative properties. So this is the kind of the journey of food, supported by the recipe that you can see in this early 19th century Regency kitchen complex. Number 12 here is down a flight of stairs into the cellars, but number 11 is the final stop-off point, where everything gets the once over, checked off to make sure it's looking okay, garnished properly, domes put on if needed be to keep the dishes warm before all of the food in the 18th century, coming into the early 19th century, served the Convention of Service à la Française, coming into this final area, which is the dining room. And here we have the dining room and fossa, which again is very flamboyant, elaborate. But there's also kind of, I suppose, a rarefied, refined atmosphere about this space, which separates it from the activities, the labor, the intensity of all of the work that went into this final act of consumption, with all of the objects surrounding it, the ware, the silver, the specialized items of utensils and so on that we see emerging in the 18th century. So this calm, I suppose, speaks little of the effort that went into sustaining the food and culinary cultures of this elite, wealthy group in Ireland and in Britain. So you have a whole body of staff that are working behind the scenes in these noisy, hot areas, behind the green baize door, as they say, to service this front of house. And as I say, this says little about the energy and the activities, not just in the kitchen complex, but in the kitchen gardens, in the orchards, in the farm, the local suppliers, the butchers, the milk sellers, the grocers, the specialist importers, and so on. The markets that might be local, the markets that might be in Britain, bringing in Gloucester cheese, for example, the European markets that are bringing in the dried fruits, things like the Parmesan cheese, and of course then the transatlantic markets that are bringing in these new exotic ingredients like chocolate, potatoes, and of course the one that we have spoken about and emphasized more so than any other ingredient in this talk today, sugar. And I suppose the dark tale of exploitation that is divorced from these settings, and that we are now I suppose, remembering the breakthrough and seminal work of Sidney Mince, coming to think about in this context and reconsider the tremendous exploitation of the populations that serviced this insatiable demand and appetite for sugar that directed and impacted so much of food culture for a certain group in Ireland in some of the 17th, but into the 18th and early 19th centuries as well. So I am now going to stop talking. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation, and it might give you some different ways of thinking about these spaces and these buildings, maybe when you see them again, and to imagine all of the activities as it related to food going on here, the energies, the modernity of it, reaching into the Americas and so on. And how we view that now, and how our appreciation or understanding of that will change as our understanding of developments in the historical continuum changes as well. So as I say, I'm going to finish up. If you would like to use any of this material, do please just, this is a lot of my research work, so do please contact me. Just send off a quick email. My email address is there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to attempt smoothly to finish this presentation. And what I will say is thank you for joining me here today. As I say, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was useful. I hope it was insightful. And I suppose the last thing to say before I sign off completely is that I hope you enjoy some of the other activities for Heritage Week. This quite unusual Heritage Week 2020. Thank you.